So as you guys know, I am an AMD shareholder, but I haven't made an update video on the stock in a little while, and I've been receiving a lot of comments from you guys asking me to do more videos on AMD stock. So I thought today would be a good time to do a full analysis and kind of an update video for AMD stock for 2019 and let you know if I plan on buying any more shares anytime soon. So we'll talk about the company, their stock, and much more in today's video. Let's get started. What's up everybody, my name is Ala and welcome to my world of stocks. So let's go ahead and start by looking at their business and their future potential, and then we'll look at their income statement, their balance sheet, all their financials, the stock, their valuation, and then I'll do a conclusion and let you know if I plan on buying any more stock anytime soon. Now, as you guys know, AMD has been gaining a lot of steam in recent history because of their new Zen architecture chips, and most recently they've been developing new 7nm chips in partnership with Taiwan Semiconductor. I happen to own stock in both companies, although I haven't purchased any new shares in a while and mostly trimmed my positions a little when they were very high, but we'll talk more about that later in the video. In any case, AMD has either already launched or will eventually launch new 7nm chips for CPU and GPU markets, those being chips that are used in things like computers, gaming consoles, and even data center servers. And of course, AMD is heavily involved in buzzworthy trend markets like machine learning, deep learning, big data, HPC or high performance computing, the Internet of Things, and artificial intelligence. Now, speaking of their 7nm products, even though it's been argued that AMD's 7nm can be compared to Intel's 10nm, AMD's smaller manufacturing process is still a major improvement on their previous chips, as the new ones translate to significantly more density and higher performance with less power usage. This is a big deal as Intel is still producing many of their chips on 14nm and is still struggling to launch a full lineup of 10nm products, as you can see on this chart here. Another major competitor of AMD is of course Nvidia on the GPU side, and even they're lagging behind with their RTX cards still being based on a 12nm process, with the previous generation being on 16. Although to be fair, both Intel and Nvidia processors have many other things going for them, generally offer better performance than AMD, and are usually the top and premium choice among gamers, professionals, and even corporations. However, AMD's recent innovations have been leading to stronger performance. In 2018, the company increased sales by 23% year over year, improved their gross margins by 4 percentage points, and was even profitable on a GAAP basis by hundreds of millions of dollars. We'll talk more about that later in the video when we cover their financials, but a lot of the success is thanks to their Ryzen CPUs and their data center processors called EPYC and Radeon Instinct, all of which should have 7nm versions at some point later this year. And speaking of the data center, AMD estimates that that addressable market could be worth somewhere close to $30 billion, with $17 billion coming from the CPU side and $12 billion coming from the GPU side. Of course, AMD competes in both, as they have EPYC CPUs to compete with Intel and Radeon Instinct GPUs to compete with Nvidia. And although Intel and Nvidia both destroy AMD in terms of market share, I've always had the more optimistic view on AMD in terms of them being able to actually steal market share, whereas the others may have a little more to lose. I just felt like AMD has a little more upside potential in that sense if they can deliver on these innovative products. Now, that's not a knock on Intel or Nvidia. In fact, I'm actually a shareholder of Nvidia myself, but I do think that there is at least enough room for AMD to make significant progress if they make the right moves. For context, AMD only did around $6.4 billion in total revenue for the entire year, so there is an enormous amount of growth still out there for AMD, especially in that huge data center market. Speaking of which, EPYC processor shipments more than doubled in their last quarter, extended partnerships were announced with the two biggest data center players in the world in Amazon and Microsoft, and their 7nm Rome version is still on track to launch later this year, not to mention that they have a number of other big name partnerships with companies like Tencent, Baidu, Oracle, and more. Keep in mind that AMD's 7nm EPYC Rome chip will have 64 cores and 128 threads, which is more than double the cores and threads that Intel's best chips offer. This ultimately translates to better performance across various price points, at least until Intel can deliver on their 10nm promises, which I think won't be launched until 2020, but you guys can correct me if I'm wrong in the comment section below. And while while AMD currently controls just around 2% of the server CPU market, they're expected to climb to at least 5% this year, which could easily equate to around $1 billion of revenue alone. And another area that I could see AMD continuing to perform well is gaming, as the gaming market alone is growing by billions of dollars every year, and AMD should be powering the next generation of Xbox and PlayStation home consoles. My prediction is that we'll likely see a new custom APU for the consoles using a combination of custom Ryzen CPU and Navi GPU processors. Now, speaking of GPUs, we know that Intel normally dominates the integrated market because they bundle them with their processors in what we call APUs. But when looking at the discrete GPU market that is focused on individual GPU chips, that's controlled almost exclusively by NVIDIA and AMD. Although Intel does have future plans to enter the market at some point in the future, probably in 2020. Still, there are even more concerns here for AMD, as John Petty Research just published their newest research report for 2018, and we can see that AMD's market share dropped considerably in the fourth quarter, both quarter over quarter and year over year, while NVIDIA actually saw significant gains. However, AMD bulls would argue that this can shift in 2019, as AMD plans to release new 7nm GPUs that will offer similar performance to NVIDIA for likely a cheaper price. Now, previously they launched two Vega GPUs back in 2017 to compete with NVIDIA, but those cards used a lot of power and still performed worse than NVIDIA, so they didn't really do much damage. But turning our attention to this year, there are two main markets to focus on that of course branch out to smaller ones. Those being the premium desktop and mobile market worth $15 billion and the machine learning data center market worth $12 billion. Again, keep in mind that the size of these markets completely eclipse anything that AMD is currently doing in terms of revenue. But starting with the former market, AMD has their Radeon Vega 7 for gaming, which is the first 7nm gaming GPU for the general consumer market, aimed at competing with NVIDIA's 2080. I personally think that they could have done more with that chip in terms of performance and price, but I'm hopeful that Navi will be more impressive in the near future. More on that later. And then they also have the Radeon Vega Mobile that customers do seem to be pretty happy with, as it works great for ultrabooks, laptops, and MacBooks. In the latter market, the Radeon Instinct MI60 is still based on Vega architecture, but it is the first 7nm GPU for the data center market and is built specifically for machine learning with huge improvements from the previous generation, with 2 times more density and 1.25 times higher performance, despite using the same power, which can actually be 50% lower if used at the same frequency. But again, I think that the real excitement will come with their newer Navi architecture that should launch either later this year or at least by 2020. And my guess is that some form of Navi will be running on the next generation of home gaming consoles, probably as part of a custom APU. But speaking a little further to the great things coming from AMD this year, we know that they've already started to close the CPU performance gap with Intel thanks to Ryzen and Ryzen 2 CPUs, but later this year AMD will also be launching Ryzen 3 that is based on the 7nm process. In fact, at CES in January, AMD showed that their 8-core Ryzen chip had very similar performance to Intel's i9 chips, but used 30% less power and will likely cost less than Intel, as is usually the case with AMD chips. Regardless, I think we can all agree that what AMD is doing now versus what they did in the past is very impressive, and it's at the very least giving them the opportunity to steal more market share in the future. But how have these moves been translating to their financial figures? Well, let's now transition to their income statement and their balance sheet, and then we'll end the video by looking at their stock and valuation. Okay, so in their last fiscal year, they increased revenue by 23%, gross margin was up 4 percentage points, and net income went from a loss of $33 million the year prior to now $337 million in profit on a GAAP basis. Non-GAAP was even better, where they saw net income rise to over $500 million in profit, and that's the highest profitability that we've seen in 7 years. However, their last quarter and their guidance for the next quarter wasn't as bright. Revenue still increased year over year, but only by 6% and dropped by 14% quarter over quarter. Guidance for Q1 was also much worse, as they expect sales to drop by around 24% year over year. Of course, that would be horrible performance, and the reasons given were due to excess channel inventory, mostly being caused by the cryptocurrency crash that is now leaving secondhand GPUs out in the market for cheaper prices, making it difficult to sell through their newer products. However, the stock actually climbed in after hours trading on that earnings day because Wall Street was only expecting revenue growth of 6% for the year, but AMD said that they expect it to be a high single-digit percentage, which will likely be a little higher than what Wall Street was expecting. And that's despite all of those cryptocurrency concerns as they begin to recover and eventually return to a normal GPU channel. And I think the reasons why AMD is so optimistic is because of those 7nm products that we talked about earlier, especially Ryzen CPUs and the EPYC and Radeon processors for the data center market. But let's transition now to their balance sheet, and we can see here that they have over $1 billion in cash, over $1.2 billion in net receivables, and over $3.5 billion in current assets, with over $4.5 billion in total assets. When looking at their liabilities, they have less than $2 billion in current liabilities and less than $3.3 billion in total liabilities, giving them a current ratio of around 1.75 and a total ratio of around 1.3. I personally like to see a stronger balance sheet than this, but given how much money needs to be reinvested into research and development because of the nature of their business and the fact that they only now started being profitable again, I'd say that their balance sheet is fine for now and will likely improve in the future. But turning now to their stock and their valuation, we can see that they are up almost 500% in the past 5 years, up almost 100% in the past 1 year, and up almost 25% year to date, now trading at almost $23 a share. Of course, this absolutely amazing performance has led to a pretty rich valuation, which according to Yahoo Finance gives them an enormous trailing PE ratio of over 70. However, Wall Street does expect things to improve as they give them a much better forward PE of around 23, and when factoring in future growth, their PEG ratio comes in at just around 1.1, which is pretty decent. Still, their PS and PB ratios are both pretty high, coming in at 3.5 and 18.2 respectively. That PB ratio is definitely very high. In any case, I think Q1 and Q2 will be very weak quarters for AMD, especially Q1 as they projected, 24% decline year over year in revenue. But I also think that Q3 and Q4 will probably be much stronger because of their newer products that are launching this year, but also because AMD is actually projecting that they will see revenue increase in the year by a high single-digit percentage, and that's despite Q1 seeing a huge drop in revenue of around 24%. At least that's what they're expecting. But for me personally, my cost basis on AMD is still in the low teens, so I'm not really excited to be picking up more AMD shares at these prices. But if the stock was to drop down to the teens, I'd reconsider picking up more shares for the long term. And I also think that 2019 and 2020 will be very volatile years for the stock market. So I think the market might drag down the stock just kind of on its own too because of that really rich valuation. I mean, you can't forget that trailing PE is still way up there. But still, if the stock gets dragged down lower, then I would reconsider adding more to my position for the long term, because I do still think that AMD is doing some very innovative things, and I like where the company is headed. I like their trajectory, and I think they do have a lot of potential, short-term, medium-term, and even long-term. So that's how I feel about AMD. Let me know how you feel about it down in the comment section. Are you invested in AMD, or do you plan on buying any shares anytime soon? Or would you like to see the stock kind of come down a little bit before you consider jumping into any position? Or do you just not believe in the company at all? I'd love to hear your thoughts, and give me your reasons why down below. And make sure you hit the like button if you enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks for everything. Take care. Bye-bye.